Hey, what's up, guys? Hope everybody is well. I'm back here with another installment in my Wyndham Lewis series here, and I purchased this book, Wyndham Lewis, Time and Western Man. Hard book to find, hard book to purchase, and I found a copy here, and it's interesting how deleted this man is from the internet and his works, and he's got so many books and so many paintings, and he was such a prolific writer and thinker, but his thought is inconvenient for certain sensibilities that are so common in our world now that I find him very interesting. And what I'm going to do is read from the preface from Wyndham Lewis to his book, Time and Western Man. It is a thick tome. I didn't know it was this thick when I was purchasing it. From what I understand, it was on Google, downloaded in Google Books where you could read it for free. Now that has been deleted, and you can now purchase or rent, or you can read the table of contents now, but it's really hard to find the book. And it's interesting that Wyndham Lewis criticizes some of the foremost respected philosophers that kind of structure our thinking in the 20th and 21st century. Alfred North Whitehead, Henri Bergson, William James, Bertrand Russell, among others. And he wrote this book ostensibly for a lay audience, but it is pretty dense. But it is, I think, worth struggling with. And his concept that I'm most interested in is this idea of the time cult, that we kind of worship time in the way that we think about things. And he specifically traces this back to the influence, the kind of profound and pervasive influence of Henri Bergson, who I've read quite a bit of, and especially the work of Gilles Deleuze. He is credits Henri Bergson. He wrote a book on him in his conception of time and memory and matter, and the way that the past subsumes in each present moment, and a lot of these interesting ideas. And Wyndham Lewis plays a type of foil to these ideas and has some very interesting critiques. So this is maybe more of a niche type of thinker for people, but I think that my audience and you guys would appreciate, and I've got some good feedback on discussing Wyndham Lewis and his works here. So if you're interested, again, Marshall McLuhan has turned me on to Wyndham Lewis. He writes a lot about him, and so does his son, Eric McLuhan. And this is the second book that I got. The first book was, and I did a video on it, go ahead and check it out, The Childermass, which was a novel that kind of incorporates all of his ideas in this novel, fantasy, hallucinatory, interesting, fascinating book that I highly recommend as well. But what I'm going to read, I'll try to get through the whole preface here. I am back to work in an office setting, so I don't have as much time to make videos every day, every other day like I was. So I'm shooting for one or two videos a week. Would love your guys' feedback on what you think in certain topics or writers that you'd like to hear more of. And I just appreciate you guys. And please share, please like and share. I want these ideas to get out there, not to convince people of them, but just to introduce people to them and have them make their own ideas up, especially in the philosophical space, where a lot of highly qualified and well-read philosophers that I know have never heard of Wyndham Lewis, which is strange. It's very strange. And again, it's intriguing to me. So we're going to start from the preface here. This is from a library, Grant McEwen College, where I purchased this from online. It came with library stickers on it and everything. Again, hard to find. And when did he write this book? So here's just some of the titles of the books that he has written. The Apes of God, 1981, a novel. Blast 1 and Blast 2, Journals, 1981. The Complete Wild... Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah. These are all Wyndham Lewis titles. The Complete Wild Body Stories, 1982. Journey into Barbary, Self-Condemned, Studi Barnett. There's just a bunch here. I mean, such a prolific writer. It's fascinating. So here, this book was written, 1993. No, 1927 was when this book was written. And the copyright of this book is 1993, but these are thoughts and ideas from the early 20th century. And I'll read a little bit from maybe the table of contents here, right? So book one, it's into two parts. Book one is entitled The Revolutionary Simpleton. and some of the chapters, some of the meanings of romance, the principle of advertisement and its relation to romance, romance in the moralist mind, the romance of action, art movements and the mass idea, the revolutionary simpleton, the Russian ballet, the most perfect expression of the high bohemia, the principal revolutionary tendency today, that of a return to earlier forms of life, Ezra Pound, a test for counterfeit in the arts, a brief account of the child cult, Time, Children, Miss Gertrude Stein and Miss Anita Luce, the prose song of Gertrude Stein, The Secret of the Success of Charlie Chaplin, A Man in Love with the Past, an analysis of the mind of James Joyce, conclusion to Book 1, and then appendix to Book 1. And then Book 2 is entitled An Analysis of the Philosophy of Time. There's a preface. And the first chapter is Professor Alexander and the Age of Time or Motion, the Philosophy of the Instruments of Research, Spatialization and Concreteness, Pure Poetry and Pure Magic, Romantic Art Called in to Assist in the Destruction of Materialism, The Popular Counters, Action and Life, Time upon the Social Plane and in Philosophy, The Fusion of Idealism and Realism, and then History as the Specific Art of the Time School, The Chronological Philosophy of Spengler, Conclusion of Analysis of Spengler. He criticizes and engages with Spengler quite a lot. The Subject Convinced as King of the Psychological World. The last few sections here, Science and Skepticism, Belief in Reality, God as Reality, The Object Conceived as King of the Physical World, Space and Time, and then a conclusion. So we'll start with the author's preface here. This preface is addressed to the general reader. It has been my object from the start to secure an audience of people not usually attentive to abstract discussion, the general educated man or woman. Everyone, I am persuaded, must today fit themselves for thinking more clearly about the problems of everyday life by accustoming themselves to think of the abstract things existing more distinctly than ever before behind such problems. Where everything is in question and where all traditional values are repudiated, the everyday problems have become necessarily identical with the abstractions from which all concrete things in the first place come. And the everyday life is too much affected by the speculative activities that are renewing and transvaluing our world for it to be able to survive in ignorance of those speculations. So everyone, I think, in one degree or another has this alternative. Either he must be prepared to sink to the level of chronic tutelage and slavery, dependent for all he is to live by upon a world of ideas and its manipulators, about which he knows nothing, or he must get a hold, as best as he can, of the abstract principles involved in the very intellectual machinery set up to control and change him. Beautiful quote there. As best he can, quote, as best he can, I have said, and there is the difficulty. Everything in our life today conspires to thrust most people into prescribed tracks in what can be called a sort of trance of action, hurrying without any significant reason from spot to spot at the maximum speed obtainable, drugged in that mechanical activity. How is the typical individual of this epoch to do some detached thinking for himself? All his life is disposed with a view to banishing reflection. To be alone he finds terrifying. But even if that were not so, it would be difficult for him to secure the necessary seclusion for a contemplative, quote-unquote, spell in which he could bring himself abreast of the contemporary problems. His life thrusts new problems upon him in profusion and simultaneously withdraws all possibility of his getting the time to grasp them, it would seem. This is the inherent difficulty that the modern man must in some way overcome. Whether as a clearinghouse for scientific theory, a, quote, critical tribunal, or a carefully organized deposit for inherited wisdom of the great question left over when science has done, the department labeled philosophy in our modern intellectual economy is of immense practical importance. It is not merely a luxury for the idle, for the very clever in its widest interpretation. It is the department where everything ultimately comes up for judgment. Such an invention as wireless, for example, which in the first years of its appearance runs wild, left to its own devices, as it were, will certainly in the end be subjected to critical discipline for the good of us all. It is the philosophical intelligence, broadly, that reviews the claims of such a phenomenon of mechanical creation for survival and fixes the terms. But the function of philosophy has a more positive side. Notions are manufactured or concocted in its laboratory that come out later in the concrete everyday world. There they assume shapes as definite as airplanes and crystal sets, though of another order. That is why the rough ascent into the region of the abstract proposed by me in this essay should be undertaken by all those aspiring to an enfranchised position or willing to make the effort to retain it. If you balk this exciting adventure, you must sink, as things are, into a condition that will be less than free. The great technical inventions, wireless, the petrol engine, the cinema, affect radically the life of everybody. No one can fail to observe, but mere notions or philosophical theories not incarnated in any physical discovery are not so palpably influential. Yet the metaphysics of relativity, the doctrine of behavior, of gestalt, of emergent evolution, and so forth, have an ever more intimate and more insidious effect. People feel themselves being influenced, but their brain and not their crystal set is the sensitive receptive instrument. As the mechanism of the brain is not visible, the inventions of theoretic thought remain undefined for the plain man. Ideas, or systems of ideas, possess no doubt an organism, as much as a motor car or wireless set, but their techne, or application, and their components, the stuff out of which they are manufactured, are facts that are in a sense too vague to be readily accessible. It is generally felt. There is no way, however, of making this study so attractively simple that the most breathlessly busy of plain men can be induced to engage upon it with the guarantee that its essentials will be economically garaged in his head under half an hour. It is quite impossible to quote-unquote pot the thought that makes the world go round in such a way that anybody, after a fortnight's application for half an hour a day, will for the rest of his life recognize at a glance the true nature of any ideology that is sprung upon him. That cannot be done. What I think can be done is this. The more intelligent of the student youth, or the more intelligent of those people of whom there are a fair number who follow the transformations of the intellect, can have their attention directed first to certain manifestations of will or purpose in the life around them, and then they can be referred back to certain ideas that are the origin of those things. Some art form, as with popular music, suddenly takes a new and unexpected turn. Jazz is such a mode. Purpose is betrayed in this event, but the average man marvels, and if he asks himself why, seeking to account for this appearance, he always has the zeitgeist to fall back on, if he has no other answer. Crossword puzzles, community singing, and so on flower for him for no reason. They are, quote-unquote, nature, fate, zeitgeist, not the work of man. He who is so prone to personalize everything never sees a human activity expressing itself in these things for some reason. Of course, the paths that lead from the metaphysical principle to the event upon the plane of everyday occurrence to the happenings of politics or of social fashion are often very complexly disposed. Even if people are a little familiar with the ideational background and thoroughly familiar with the concrete outcropping in fact and in history, it is not always easy to demonstrate the uninterrupted liaison. But some kind of chart of these relations can be drawn up so that the general reader can equate things that at first sight have little connection. But suppose that you advance such a statement as following. 1. Sacco and Vanzetti are executed under such and such circumstances. That is owing to the over-emotional strain in the composition of Hegel that made his mind an imperfect philosophic instrument. 3. The reason that philosophic instrument exercised the influence it did was on account of the romanticism prevalent in the years succeeding the French Revolution. 4. Because it served the ends of this person in that, etc., etc. I am not maintaining the truth of this particular assertion, but merely taking that concrete event for the purpose of topical illustration, and suggesting, not too wild, a liaison from that. If you said that the average person would be done none the wiser, in the first place because Hegel, whose philosophy in any case is a very repulsively technical one, would mean nothing to him. But the best way even to get people to learn something about philosophy would be to show it at work. The ideas of Plato can be shown at work. The philosophy of Hegel can be shown at work in Herzen, Bakunin, and Lenin. The theories of Darwin can be shown at work all over the world. Nietzsche trumpets from the balconies of the Shigi Palace. I could show you many Bergsonians. Both Bonnat, the famous French chauffeur gunman, and T.E. Hulme, the philosopher, were Sorelists, disciples of Georges Sorel, the Roman Catholic pragmatist Marxian. There, anyhow, is the best method of showing the plain man a little philosophy. And the bourgeois gentilhomme M. Jordan, referring to his own causal works, exclaims in his famous question, quote, "Ah, is this prose then that we all speak?" Close quote. He was astounded to find that what daily issued from his mouth was such an important thing as prose. In the same way, he could have been told that many of his actions were philosophy, in quite as true a sense as all his words were prose. And today, in any company of people, whether it be the highbrow tea party or cafe gathering, a labor demonstration or a cabinet meeting, what they are all doing and thinking is truly philosophy in one form or another, and however indirectly, as M. Jourdain's speech was de la prose. That is why I start my book with the concrete manifestations of the time mind. The best way to expound the time philosophy, I thought, was to show how it has acted upon Miss Stein or Mr. Joyce, Mr. D.H. Lawrence or Mr. Anderson. Miss Stein writes in her explanation of her recent literary composition, quote, "There must be time. This is the thing that is at present the most troubling, and if there is the time that is at present the most troublesome, the time sense that is at present the most troubling is the thing that makes the present the most troubling." Close quote. That gives an account, of course, in an affected stammering form, of what is in fact at the bottom of the whole transitional chaos. He who understands fully what Miss Stein means by time in this connection, not the Miss Stein that is the faux naif literary performer, but the old pupil of James and follower of Bergson, will possess the key to the transitional chaos, which he can then open at will, inform himself at his leisure of the true value of its highly advertised interior, and then close it again and lock it on the outside. The more people able to shut and lock that door, the better. When enough have learned how to do so, let us hope it will remain shut for good. The body of this chaos, pumped full of quote-unquote time in the metaphysical sense, this time called the mind of space, and which is in fact the mind of this restless chaos, that body I have extended in this book and dissected. I have especially laid bare for your inspection the clockwork of its quote-unquote mind. And that is the essential fact. Its mind is time. Professor Alexander, Space, Time, and Deity. The full meaning of the metaphysical concept, quote-unquote time, as understood in deified in contemporary philosophy and imitated in one form or another in art, is what I have set out to explore. Kind of like the thesis statement of the book looks like here. The full meaning of the metaphysical concept time, as understood and deified in contemporary philosophy and imitated in one form or another in art, is what I have set out to explore. So as I do not despise the hurried reader and would catch him, if I could, upon the wing, I will make a few suggestions that I hope may be of assistance to him in his haste. Had I written such a language as would have made my essay available for practically everybody, it could not have achieved its ends upon that plane of the, quote, learned world where it also had to act. On the other hand, I have gone out of my way to write a book that, with a little application, may be available to any averagely educated person. Shows how different education was back in the 1920s compared to today. What I hope to have done by opening my discussion of the great orthodoxy of time by discussions of works of art, novels, and pictures is to have tempted the lazier or busier of my audience into taking the critical step over into the abstract region, there where ideas and not people or events have to be encountered. Once such an unwilling or timid person or hurried man has been persuaded to grapple with one metaphysical ghost and found he has succeeded in laying it, that is, laying it out, he will perhaps proceed, encouraged by his prowess, to engage in a series of such encounters. L'appétit vient en manguet. In the end, he will be led to enter this metaphysical world, it is to be hoped, as easily as he enters his club or his own bathroom. That has at all events been my idea, or one of them. It has been my ambition to assist in the breeding of a race of transformed, hurried men in the Anglo-Saxon world who handle ideas as expertly as any other people, and whom, in consequence, it is less difficult to fool with transparently shoddy doctrines. In England and America, we want a new learned minority as sharp as razors, as fond of discourse as a Greek, familiar enough with the abstract to be able to handle the concrete. In short, we want a new race of philosophers instead of hurried men, speed cranks, simpletons, or robots. I would suggest to what is still a hurried man, dismayed at the sight of all the hard work and intricate or difficult matter confronting him on the threshold of the second book of this essay, that he should start at page 205. That is Book 2, Part 1, Chapter 7. Time upon the Social Plane and in Philosophy. The chapter is called. In that chapter, the question I set out to answer is this: is the time mind, the historic or chronological view of the world and of human life, to be found on the philosophic plane as well as upon the social and literary plane? On the latter, I've shown it to exist fairly conclusively, I think. But is there any parallel to this in the field of theoretic thought? If so, and there is no difficulty in demonstrating that there is, I claim, then surely there is likely to be some connection between the two. And further, the operations by which these two parallel cults have stimulated and seconded each other should be of considerable interest. They should provide us with a pattern by which all such interdependence could be gauged. Upon page 207, I quote Professor Alexander, where he says that it is perhaps Mr. Bergson in our day who has been the first philosopher to take time seriously. He, indeed, Bergson, finds in time conceived as duration, the animating principle of the universe. And Professor Alexander associates Bergson with the mathematical physicist in this splendid work of giving time as a metaphysical conception its just due. Quote, at the present moment, the special question of the exact relation of time to space has been forced into the front, because time has recently come into its full rights. In science, through the mathematical physicists. In philosophy, also through Professor Bergson. End quote. If the reader now turns from page 207 to page 220, he will find Dr. Wyndham Carr, Bergson's British disciple, linking up Bergson and Croce, the most renowned living Italian philosopher. They quote-unquote reach, he tells us, quote, practically an identical concept, close quote. They reach this by different roads. The fundamental agreement between the philosophy of Bergson and that of Croce, C-R-O-C-E, consists in the fact that both focus attention upon the dynamical aspect of reality. Dynamical, as the most hurried of men is aware, means the bustle and rush of action, of big business, armaments, Atlantic hops, Wall Street, and Mussolini. A quote-unquote dynamic personality means, in journalism, an iron-jawed oil king in an 8-cylinder car ripping along a new motor road with a $100 million deal in a new line of poison gas bombs blazing in his super brain, his eye aflame with the lust of battle, of those battles in which others fight and die. So there is no need to explain what dynamical means. It is no mere coincidence, says Dr. Wyndham Carr, that Bergson and Croce reach the same conclusions. No, it, quote, marks a tendency in both these exalted thinkers to emphasize the dynamic aspect of reality, close quote. But how in detail do they differ, or rather agree, these two great and influential thinkers, only each with his own way of approach? Well, for Bergson, quote, time is a material and not merely a formal element of the world, close quote. Time is the very, quote, stuff of things. Croce, on his side, does not talk about the abstraction time, but rather about history. For Croce, quote, history is identical with philosophy, close quote. As I am here engaged in showing the more breathless reader how to read the chapter I have indicated as a good one to start with, if, as is probable, he balks the solid track I have laid down and wishes for a shortcut, I will go a few steps farther with him. Next, he can turn to page 211. There he will see a quotation from Bosanquet for the Italian idealist philosopher such as Gentile, as much for the English realist such as Alexander, quote, in its basis and meaning, reality is a history or an unending dialectical progress. Here's the quote again. In its basis and meaning, reality is a history or an unending dialectical progress. If that doesn't sum up the 20th century and 21st century mode of thinking, I don't know what does. But this is what Dr. Wilden Carr has just asserted in his summary of the doctrine of Croce. Quote, history is identical with philosophy, close quote. All reality is history tout court. So we now have in front of us a group of philosophers gathered from various fields of thought. There is Alexander, Gentile, Bergson, Croce, Wilden Carr. In its very heart and its very roots, for all of them, reality is, quote unquote, history, or reality is, quote unquote, time, which is the same thing. That is the capital fact, with all it implies, that has to be firmly grasped and understood. But what is time? That is a question that Spengler says no one should ever have been allowed to ask, but that the reader, nevertheless disregarding Spengler, will next, I hope, press on to inquire. I would then prefer him to page 159. There he will obtain a little initial information upon that subject. He will anyhow read Bergson's account of what time meant for the Hellen, in contrast to what it means for us. The chapter entitled History as the Specific Art of the Time School he might turn to next, page 245. That would inform him what is intended by history in these discussions. And then if he wished to know how history is interpreted by a typical time mind, he could turn to the analysis of Spengler's Decline of the West, page 252 to 288. That is a very long and careful analysis. If you were not familiar with Spengler's book, the reader would be constantly held up by the references to things with which he is not familiar. So I would only refer him to that to suggest that he should read it here and there with a view to gathering some further notions as to what history for Spengler or Croce means. As to my own position in this controversy and the impulse that has brought me out to attack this formidable league, I cannot do better than reproduce more or less verbatim the preface that appeared at the head of the Revolutionary Simpleton when that appeared in the essay in my review, The Enemy. This essay is a comprehensive study of the time notions which have now in one form or another gained an undisputed ascendancy in the intellectual world. In Book 1, the time mind, as I have called it, is considered in its more concrete manifestations as we find it, notably in the works of fiction, poetry, or painting. In Book 2, the significance of all that type of belief and feeling which can conveniently be marshaled under the concept of time is examined in detail. How the timelessness of Einsteinian physics and the time-obsessed flux of Bergson merge in each other, and how they have conspired to produce upon the innocent plane of popularization a sort of mystical time cult is shown. How history and biography, and more particularly autobiography, are more truly than anything else the proper expression of this chronological philosophy is canvassed in the literary criticism of Book 1 and in the analysis of Spengler's World as History doctrine in Book 2. As the object of this book is ultimately to contradict and, if possible, defeat these particular conceptions upon the popular, the concrete plane where they present themselves as it is in a rather misleading form, I have attempted to present my argument in the plainest manner that I could. With this end in view, I've chosen to open my discussion among books such as those of Proust or Joyce, which have been widely read and which are popularly accessible, and in which I consider that, with a very little attention, the time cult can be observed in full operation. In this way, I, at the outset, unmask the will that is behind the time philosophy by displaying it in the heart of the representative ferment produced by it, in the full instinctive indulgence and expansion of the artistic impulse, and imposing its values upon the impressionable material of life. The main characteristic of the time mind from the outset has been a hostility to what is called the spatializing process of a mind, not a time mind. It is this spatializing capacity and instinct that it everywhere assails. In its place, it would put the time view, the flux. It asks us to see everywhere subspecie temporis. It is the criticism of this view, the time view, from the position of the plastic or the visual intelligence, that I am submitting to the public in this book. It is the end of the preface. Let me know what you guys think. It's a little dense, a little abstract, but I think it's worth the struggle. So thanks for listening, guys. God bless. Take care.